Hi and welcome to the Jem Hawkes YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today. For the free wire tutorial on YouTube, I'd like to share a technique for a mini coronation crown. Now I'm going to show you these on the board in just a moment so you can see what they look like. You can make them ever so slightly smaller and use them as rings. It's quite a large one on my finger there, it's just a little bit too large for me. But you can also size the technique up to make a really lovely bangle design. I will show you these down on the board so you can see exactly what our project is today. Let's get cracking with that tutorial. So here's a closer look at my mini coronation crown. Now these can be sized down and be made into adorable finger rings, or you can size them up and make them into very wearable bangles, bracelets. You can even do just a small section as a bar and then add chain across the back. It's a really lovely, versatile and quite mindful weaving design to work with. So you could also use these in dolls' houses, especially if your doll's house has a royal flavour, something that's really quite attractive to have hanging around the place, or just as a memento, or you could really size it up and stick it on your head. So there are two basic techniques. The first is to make the section that holds the beads rather. And then the second is to add that to a crown base. So this is the design that we're going to be working towards. What I will do is make it just slightly larger so it's easier for you to see on the board, but I will leave that little fella just there for reference. Now I'm going to be working with a scrap of 20 gauge 0.8mm wire. What I would say is, until you know exactly how much you want to create of this little crystal or gemstone or bead bearing segment, if you can work from the reel, all the better. When I made this bracelet, which goes 3/4 of the way around my wrist, I used about 2.5 to 3 feet of that 0.8mm gauge wire. So if you wanted to recreate that, probably 3 feet or so for this part of the tutorial. The main tools I'm using today are my professional flush cutters, my bent chain nose pliers, and my 4 and 6mm bail making pliers. If you don't have those, you can use the multi-step or different stages on your round nose pliers. So I'm going to start over at one end. As I say, I'm working with a scrap of wire. If you're making a ring, you probably only need about 10 to 12 inches or so, but you can just continue to make it until you think you have enough of a strip to fulfill your requirements. So I'm going to start by making sure that there's a nice flush cut on one end. Let's just get that away to the scrap pot, and I'm going to start with the 4mm hoop. Now this 4 and 6mm pin on my bail makers is ideal for the bracelet or the bangle. You will want to use smaller pins if you're creating a ring or a little doll's coronation crown. So let's twist that around the smaller of my two pins to begin with, and I'm just going to allow that to cross over very slightly at the point where the wire begins. What I want to do is put a little bit of warmth into that wire as well. We've got a good flush cut just at the top here. I'm then going to switch to the larger size on my pliers and just put that pin adjacent to the first loop that we've created. If I wrap that all the way around, you'll see that what we've created is a nice little upside down pear shape. And that's what we're looking to generate for the section that houses the crystal or the bead. So with my 4 and 6mm gauge pins on my bail makers, I've got some lovely 6mm beads which I'm going to insert into this design. You'll just need to size that down for the fingering. It's just a little bit easier to show you with slightly larger beads. So what I want to do now is continue swirling around to create the next small segment. Now the smaller loops, the 4mm loops, sit along the lower line of the section we're creating. You can also use this as bezel strip if you give it a little bit of work hardening, so it's quite versatile and quite pleasant to make up. So I'm going to pop the smaller of those two pins in and allow that wire to wrap all the way around. So I'm just going to continue to circle that until it comes off on the other side. So you can see we've done a small loop, we've created an upside down pear, and then we're going to continue around with the smaller pin until that starts to lift up and it sits up against comes away and sits up against the larger pin on your bail makers. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to zoom out slightly so I can show you more clearly the process, and then I'll get that cropped so that you don't see the rest of my messy desk. So you can see we've rotated around to create a small loop. We've continued in the same direction to create a larger loop in an upside down pear shape, crossing over and returning down to that imaginary baseline. I've gone all the way around one time, continued the wire along that imaginary baseline, and then I've popped my bail makers back into position. What I want to do now is to draw the wire all the way around that larger of the two pins. Now when I'm crossing the wires over, in order to keep my strip of this wire formation as level as possible, I tend to take the wire underneath the preceding loop one time, and then the next time I'll take it over the top, and that just stops it from building up and up and up and becoming a little bit unwieldy. Once I've got that basic shape and position, I'm going to retract that pin out, move it so that it's only the large pin that's in place, and then I'm going to draw that wire all the way around underneath so that it crosses over and continues on to make another one of these upside down pear shapes. Now it can get a little bit unwieldy, so I'm just going to tighten that up slightly, smooth some warmth into the wire, and then rotate those pliers around so that I get the beginning of a shape on that smaller pin for the next wrap. So I bring that around, and then I will retract those pliers again, pop the pliers back in, and this time, instead of taking the tail of wire underneath all of this strip over to the left hand side, you can simply flip this over and do the exact reverse if you are left hand dominant. So I'm going to bring the wire over the top of the formation this time and start drawing that all the way around. If I push the larger of my two pins up so that it sits up here next to the preceding upside down pear shape, I'm just going to squish that wire down, push the wire all the way up so it sits adjacent to the larger of the pins, remove the tool again, and you can see what we're starting to form here. I am just going to pinch very, very firmly so that I don't lose the shape that I've created so far. Put a little bit of warmth in here, pop my pliers back into position and start creating a form around that large pin again. So I'm going to bring it underneath the preceding formation this time, and I'll just continue to switch as I go through. So I've started to create the little pear drop shape. I need to retract my pliers and then sit them back in so that it is only the large side that's in position. So draw that wire back across the base to create that upside down pear shape again. Then I can rotate the pliers around to bring that smaller pin so that it sits here, ready to create that little baseline. We're going to add a strengthening wire at a point in time, push that wire up, then I will retract the pin, pop the pin back in. Because I went over the top last time, I'll bring that wire round underneath. Or did I go? Well, you'll probably remember better than I do. I can have a look and I can see that I went all the way over the top, so I'm going to take that tail of wire underneath. If you're anything like me, you can't keep stuff in your head for longer than 3 seconds. There we go. So I've created a series of loops, small ones at the base, which have this little double line wrapping down here. So you can see if I lift that up, there's a double line just on the base. Push the wire all the way around so that it sits up against that larger of the two pins. Retract the pliers, pop them back in, and then we're going to draw that wire all the way around. You will probably have a system for remembering which way is up and which way is down. You could do odds and evens, whatever makes you happy. So I'm going to just push those pliers into position, start rotating the wire around the smaller of the two pins again. Retract the pliers, pop them back in so that only the smaller pin is there, and then we'll take this one over the top, just for giggles, because genuinely, I've already forgotten. So I'm going to just twist those pliers around, and then squish everything down cautiously, and you'll see that it actually doesn't take that long to build up once you get that rhythm Let's just put those pliers into position, draw that all the way around. You can get into a situation where you start to move this a lot faster. You won't have to think quite so much. When you get towards the end of the wire that you're working with, let's say that this is the length of, let's call it wire strip for now, or bead bearing strip. This is going to be the part of our crown that bears the beads. Pop that back down. Once you've got enough of a distance from the start point to the end point, you can simply trim away. And in order to make that nice and secure, I'm just going to pop that plier back in. Make sure that I'm happy with that loop, and then just trim away that last little bit very carefully, so that the cut lands dead centre bottom on that last loop. In the next section, I'm going to show you how you can lay a string of beads into the upper section on that lovely crown or coronation crown strip that we've created. And after that, I'll show you how to bring it all together with a heavier gauge of wire, just to ensure that that has some nice rigidity to it. Let's head back down to the board. So I've generated a little strip of wire ready to create into this lovely coronation crown, a mini crown or a ring, whatever you're going to work for. And I've decided that this is enough for the piece I want to work on today. Now, in order to help me make this nice and strong, the first thing that I will do is I will just take my chain nose pliers and I will grip, not overly gently, but not too forcefully, on each of the loops up at the top. And that will just help keep the shape and form, and you know that that will be the same sort of size and shape all the way along. Now, what we don't want to do is press hard anywhere wire crosses over, but what you might like to do is take a moment just to line up all of those little double loops down at the bottom. One of the reasons I love using bent chain nose pliers is you can get right in there and just tidy up any funny angles that stick out to you. So I'm going to use a scrap of wire because I'm only going to set a couple of beads. What I would say is there is a ratio of probably just over double the distance of your little crown strip. So this would actually work for the strip, but I'm not going to repeat and repeat and repeat again the same process. What I'm going to do is show you how to start at one end, and then we will move along a little way. So what I want to do is just lay around about an inch over the end of one of the upper loops, and I'm just going to hold that in position, employ my pliers. Now this is a scrap piece of wire. It's just over double the length, so whatever length you're working to here, double that, and it's 0.4mm or 26 gauge. I laid an inch over the end, and I'm going to wrap around that little section just at the very end in the upper loop 2 or 3 times. Whatever makes you happy. You will need to do that at least twice to make it secure. What I'm going to do next is bring that tail over the top of the design and then tuck it inside the very end lower loop, just up at the top. Now I am going to apply a little bit of pressure here just to make sure that everything is neat and tidy. I'll bring that up slightly closer to you, and then I will wrap at least 3 times to secure the end. If you think of it in a way as casting on if you're a knitter, it's just getting a good solid beginning connecting point to your main heavier frame. So I'm going to trim away that last little bit, and I've left a tiny bit just past. So what I can do is rotate that around and get that to sit neatly and smoothly. So I've got 3 wraps around that little end loop, and then 3 wraps around the first section of the upper loop. And what I will do now is just pop this down onto the board so I can grab one of those 8mm beads. I'm working with a nice sparkly lepidolite today, which is the bead I used in this oversized finger ring. Now this is just a shortened section to give you an idea of the way that you can play around with this design. You can go for just the front, and if I was working with 6mm beads in a ring, I would definitely want to only have that going over the front. I also made some samples with some teeny tiny 2.5mm faceted rondelles, so that I would have no hesitation in taking all the way around the finger. Certainly something that you would need to consider. It's more of a cocktail ring. It's definitely not an everyday wear item. That 0.8 or 20 gauge wire isn't going to, even though you strengthen it a little bit, it's not going to stand up to too much. So don't take it shopping with heavy bags with you. So I'm going to now invert the strip of coronation crown. And what I'm going to do is ensure that that's all neat and tidy and add my first bead in. So we're looking at the top side, the upper side of that coronation crown strip. And I'm going to allow that to slide all the way down so that it sits inside that first loop. Now if I bring that up to the camera just slightly, what I want to do is take one circuit around the second side of the loop that holds that bead. So what I will do is allow the bead to sit in position, bring the wire up inside the loop that's going to bear the bead, push the bead back into position, and then try to get my hand out of the way of the camera and bring that all the way around. So you do need to get a little bit of tension in this, but you do also want to support your work. I'm going to just tighten up that wrap ever so slightly to make sure it's neat and tidy. I'm then going to retract until I can find the very end of that wire, and I'm going to wrap 3 times around the lower loop on that strip of coronation crown. So because we're upside down at the moment, it's just looking like the upper loop, but it isn't. It will be the lower loop. Now this is a scrap of wire, so it's misbehaving slightly. You will have more fun if you use new wire. And again, to remind you, this is 26 gauge 0.4. I'm going to wrap 3 times around that smaller loop that sits between the 2 larger bead bearing loops on my coronation crown strip. Once I've got those 3 wraps into position, and you can completely fill that if you wish to, it depends how big you made the gaps, trying to keep them even is important. What I want to do now is just turn this sideways, and I'm going to wrap once around the first side of the next adjacent bead bearing loop. So if I pop that end of wire down through the centre, pull that into position, again I'm using scrap wire here, and make sure that I have one good strong rotation around the first side of that bead bearing loop. I now need to bring in my next bead, which are currently on a strand in a bag on the other side of the known universe, because obviously. Let's bring the next bead into position. These, as I mentioned, are sparkly purple lepidolite. What's not to love? So I'm just going to sit that. Again, we're upside down on that coronation strip at the moment. And what I want to do now is to allow the bead to sit just above that loop, bring the tail of wire all the way around, up inside from underneath in the bead bearing loop, push that carefully into position whilst you get that tension, draw the wire underneath, and then we're going to wrap 3 times around what will become the lower loop. Now my wire is being tricksy, so I'm just going to put my hand inside that wire loop to stop it from twisting. What will happen quite often is it will twist around like a key in a lock, and it will make a horrible bend, and then you'll have to start again. So in order to prevent that, use new wire, don't use scraps. So that's once, just again controlling the flow of wire, bringing that up for a second rotation around the smaller of the loops that we've created for that coronation strip, and then one more time to generate that 3rd wrap, controlling the tension to make sure that it's neat and tidy. Again, you can completely fill that little linking loop if you prefer, absolutely up to you. So what I want to do now is to make sure that I have got a couple of good wraps around the first side of that bead bearing loop. Like so. I've gone the wrong way, so I'm just going to push that back out. I'm supposed to go over the top. So take the tail of the wire down inside the loop. Now the reason for that, and the reason I leave my mistakes in my videos, is to make it plainly clear that everybody makes mistakes from time to time, but also how you can fix it. Even with a scrap of wire, we've wrapped once around the first side of that loop, the bead bearing loop. I now need to grab the last bead that I'm going to demonstrate with. Let's pop that onto the wire. Got to find the hole in the bead, and that's always a drama for me. Allow that to sit down into position. Just hold that gently above the bead bearing loop. Bring the tail of wire over the top, around underneath, up inside that bead bearing loop, hit the camera, and then pull that nice and tight. So we will then go for 3 wraps around the top of the lower loop. Make sure that you go over the top and down through the centre to generate the first wrap on the first side of the bead bearing loop. Lay the bead over the top, Wrap once around by bringing the tail up inside, and then continue until you get as far along as you need. Now, if you feel that you have generated 1 or 2 loops too far, it is possible to shorten this design. If you suggested that this was just one little section too long, what you can do is very, very carefully snip away only the section and make sure that you end with the lower, smaller loop. What you will want to do is make sure that everything is good and straight and that you can strengthen that last little bit. And I'm just squishing down where there is a single pass of wire. So you will continue until you have fitted all of your beads onto your strip of coronation crown. I'm going to call it bezel, why not? So I've continued all the way along to create my mini coronation crown strip, and I'm going to show you now how you can add that to a base wire and also how you can form that into relevant pieces of jewellery or decorative arts. Let's head back down to the board and I'll get on with that now. So when I placed my last bead, I wrapped 3 times around the last edge and then a further 3 times around that lower loop at the very, very end of the coronation strip there. One thing that I would suggest you do is just take a second to make sure that everything is nice and straight, and you can help yourself along a little bit by just opening and closing very, very gently to line up those lower double loops. The next thing we're going to use is, and this again is a piece of scrap wire for me, a 1mm 18 gauge wire. I'm working with soft raw copper just because I love it, and also it does show up nicely on the camera. So this is a piece that is around about 1 inch longer on either end. This is only about 4 or 5 inches in length that I'm working with because I'm making the mini crowns. If you were making a piece to wear as a larger jewellery or as an armlet, perhaps for upper arm jewellery, whatever you want to do with the technique, there's lots and lots of different applications. You'll need to have a good inch of wire on either end, unless you're looking to do something a little bit more with it. And you absolutely can. You can add this to stretches of wire that are much, much longer if you wanted to weave those and have a little bit more fun. For instance, if you were making an armlet, it might be easier to do that. Now I'm using 1mm or 18 gauge wire, and again this is a scrap length, 2 inches longer than the actual strip that I'm working with here. I'm going to give it a little bit of a smooth and a warm just to make sure that it's good and straight to begin with. That really does help. You will also want it to be slightly flexible when you come to form it to whatever shape you wish to. The next wire that I'm going to use is 0.4mm or 26 gauge, and I tend to go for around about 1.5 times the length of the area we're going to be wrapping. So for me, because I'm just making a mini coronation crown, this is the area that I'll be wrapping, so I need wire that's at least double that length. If you were looking to continue with weaving on either side, perhaps if you can work with much longer sections of wire. So what I tend to do with designs like this is start in the middle of my base wire, on the middle of my scrap of wire that I'm using, and I will wrap twice around that base wire. The reason I do this is because it means I don't then have to feed as the maximum amount of wire through these small loops. I'm only ever feeding half of the maximum amount of wire. So if I line that up with the central position, I will just complete another loop actually, so I've got 2 visible wraps in the gap between those 2 lower loops. So if I just bring my hands up slightly, I've wrapped twice around the centre of my heavier wire, my 18 gauge 1mm, using the centre of my light wire, that 0.4 or 26 gauge. So if I move my hand over to the side and pinch the assembly together, what I'm going to do now is wrap twice around both that lower straight line that becomes our baseline and the lower loop, which has got that little bit of doubling to it. So if I pop the tail of the wire through and draw that down, it needs to sit on top of my baseline wire. I'm going to take it through for a second time because this is quite a substantial part of the tutorial, is that you need to connect these 2 pieces together really nicely. So I've gone for 2 really nice tight wraps around that doubled loop at the base there. And then I'm going to take the tail and wrap twice around just the base wire in the gap underneath the upper loop that bears that bead. So you can scooch those up together. You can have them separated out like a little helix if you prefer. Those are quite tightly closed up together. It's up to you what you want to do. You could use infinitely more wire and completely fill. It makes it slightly more comfortable to wear as a ring if you do. I'm making mine as decorative items, but you could use lots and lots of wire and completely fill with wrapping that section that sits beneath the 2 lower loops. I'm just going for a 2 and 2. So I'm going to wrap twice around the lower loop, making sure that I don't leave a gap, making sure that that lower loop sits on top, not in front or behind. So that's 1 wrap, and then a 2nd wrap all the way through the loop, tying it neatly and firmly and tidily to my baseline. I'm then going to go for a wrap once, a wrap twice. I'm going to keep those 2 together before returning to take the tail up through the loop, the non-bead bearing loop, pull that down into position, nice and firmly but without distorting any of your wires. Take that tail all the way through again, making sure that they don't cross over. If they do cross over, just pull that back ever so slightly. Get that nice and neat instead. Scooch those up together if that's the aesthetic that you're going for, and continue on your merry way. When you get to the very end, in fact we should just go there, it won't take nary a moment. Not quite sure where that comes from, but there we go. So I'm going to go for 2 wraps inside the loop to that baseline. Pull that nice and neatly into position. 2 wraps around the gap between the beads. And then we're going to finish off with 2 wraps around that last loop to connect the assembly together firmly. And then when you've taken that 2nd wire through the loop, what we're going to do is try to wrap 3 times around just the base wire. So things are getting a little bit neat and tidy now. It's all starting to look a little bit more regal. So we're going to take that tail and I'm going to wrap it 3 times around the base wire. Now what you can do if you want to, again, is, as I say, continue wrapping all the way along, especially if you're going to make something fun like a Regal inspired armlet. You'll want to use loads and loads of wire, but it does make it just a little bit tricky to show you on camera. Just trying to get that end tidied away neatly. There we go. So what I will do now is continue in the opposite direction. If you flip that over, what you will find is rather than going up through the loop, you'll be going down through the loop. It doesn't really matter as long as you can see exactly what's going on. So I'm going to push the wire down through the loop there, pull that neatly into position, making sure that there's no gaps or bagginess in there, and just continue until I hit the other end of my little coronation strip. So I've continued creating that coronation strip all the way along, finishing off with 3 wraps along that baseline, just to make sure that everything is nice and neat and tidy, and that we are all ready to move on to the next stage of the tutorial. Now my ring mandrel isn't quite large enough for the strip that I've made along here. So I'm not making a ring, I'm making a little mini coronation crown. So I'm going to employ a jeweler's tool called a torch. You could use whatever round form it is that you have available to you. What I would say is that whenever you're working with beads that have a fragility, such as glass, crystal or gemstone, you do need to just move cautiously to make sure that you're not over stressing any of those components. So I'm just going to wrap the section around the round form I've chosen to use, and I'm going to spiral it to begin with so they don't immediately cross over. That just makes my life slightly easier in the next step, which is to start getting this to sit perfectly how you desire. Already it looks pretty cool, I think. What we're going to do is to connect this at the back with very small opposing loops. Now you can make this with wrapped loops if you prefer, but because I'm making decorative items, these won't actually be worn unless you count the dolls in the doll's house. I'm just going to make open and closable loops, and by opposing, gosh, I thought I was going to start quoting Shakespeare then. What I'm going to do is to twist one wire away like so, and then the other wire I will want to come upwards, so they're at 90 degrees opposition to each other. So one is going straight towards me and one is coming up towards the camera. I'm just going to very, very gently form these into loops. Now, because the wire has seen a little bit of action, you may need to just re-warm that ever so slightly. I'm going to grab my memory wire pliers because they're really perfect for this kind of design. Now, one of these is the same size as my bail making 2-step pliers. The other one is really tiny and I'd quite like a tiny loop. The reason I'm using these instead of round nose is, there are 2 reasons actually. One is I can get a repeatable size on that loop exactly. So I'm just going to push that wire all the way around. The other one is that it's got really very, very stubby lengths, which means it doesn't come up too close to the camera. So for the other one, we're going to pop the smaller side of the loop, of the loopers or the memory wire pliers. Just rotate that wire around for a second, like so, and then I'll bring the tail all the way around. So at the moment we've got 2 wires that sit opposite to each other at approximately 90 degrees, and then I'm going to trim away those last little bits. Now, there is a little bit of wire wastage, but I'd always rather have a little bit too much wire than too little on the end. Also, when you're trying to get that strip with the beads and loops to sit neatly against the base wire, sometimes the whole assembly can slip, and if you've got an inch of wire on either end, it just gives you an extra margin for operator error. So I'm going to close up this loop on this side to begin with and give that a really, really hearty squish. So I'm work hardening the wire right now and I'm forming a functional loop. I'm not squishing down where there's that tiny bit of wrapping just at the end. And then I will do the same on the opposing loop. So you'll see that we've still got that slightly helical nature. I'm just going to address that by straightening up gently. If you prefer, you can make one of these a wrapped loop and then the other one an open and closable loop, or you can make them both open and closable like I have for decorative items. Now what we need to do is to have these 2 loops very, very close together, and I'm going to do that by hand out of respect for the beads. I've got the basic shape using my very, very expensive exclusive dollar store torch, and I'm going to continue to just fit and form this around until it sits really nicely. One loop is now sitting basically on top of the other. Now normally when I'm opening loops I will try to open them like a jump ring. What that can do is make it really tricky to get these 2 loops to mesh. So I'm going to close that back up. When I use open and closable loops such as these in jewellery, that is the technique I tend to use. However, today what I'm going to do is go against the rules and just open up the loop so it's a little bit more like a claw, and just slide the second loop in and then close it up. I wouldn't leave it open for long because there's still a little bit of warmth in my wire, and while it's malleable I want to get that sitting in its final position. So the last thing that I tend to do with these little mini coronation celebration keepsakes is just open out the top layer slightly. So all I will do here is just very, very gently draw out the beaded segment, very, very slowly. Small movements, just pressing them forward slightly. As a wearer of crowns, it's just slightly more balanced if you do that. So you can see we flared the top of the mini coronation crown out now. It sits really, really prettily. They are very, very cool with teeny tiny crystals as well. So these are 2.5mm rondelles, as are these. I think they look absolutely adorable with crystals in. I hope that you've enjoyed making these little mini coronation crown keepsakes with me. You can also use the technique as jewellery. I'll pop a photo down at the end of the video of the pieces that we've made. Have yourself a beautiful day. If you're enjoying the content, please don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. I tend to upload at 4 PM British time on a Sunday. Have a great day. Bye for now.